Leila stood at the edge of the field where old wheat whispered against the night. Above her, a spill of stars leaned in as if they'd come to listen. In her hand she held a folded page, his handwriting pressed into the paper like a map she could follow back to everything she had tried to leave behind. The town lay behind her, a cluster of lamps and opinions, a past made heavy by other people's voices. She had carried that letter for 3 years, wrapped between sheets of a worn dress, unread and sacred. Tonight the stars were the only witnesses she could trust. The letter was both anchor and accusation, evidence that someone else believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. She remembered the afternoon he left it on the windowsill of the little shop where she once worked, his shy fingers lingering, his smile like an unstruck chord. Around her, crickets stitched the dark with small, indifferent rhythms. And yet the night felt intimate. The field smelled of dust and green and something like possibility. Leila opened the page. The words blurred at first. Tears were small betrayals of pride, then drew into focus, each sentence a slow tide. Across town, in a workshop lit by a single lamp, Omar ran his thumb over a little wooden charm until the worn letters of a promise caught and trembled in his palm. 2 hearts holding paper and wood like relics, each beginning to remember what had been promised long ago. Leila had come home believing distance would change everything. She had packed a suitcase of silences and driven until the roads turned unfamiliar, until the city swallowed her shame in the anonymity of new people and new mistakes. 2 winters later, a job lost and a hospital bill folded her resolve like cheap fabric. Returning meant more than leaving. It meant facing the bank of faces that had watched her leave with curiosity rather than sorrow. The town had not lost its teeth. On the Monday she returned, the bakery's bell still sang the same bright note when she pushed the door open, but the air inside was stitched with gossip. Mrs. Hashmi's smile was a practice thing. The butcher offered her a nod that was too broad by way of excuse for a point not addressed. Her mother, slim as a virtue and twice as tired, examined Leila in the doorway like someone inspecting a returned dress for damage. "Are you sure about this?" her mother asked, though the question was less to Leila than the community. It was a question that rusted into the air and refused to be answered quickly. Leila forced a breath. "I have savings. I can manage," she said. There was a brittle honesty in her voice, battle-ready, but small. The first confrontation came that afternoon at the town council meeting. A new initiative to expand the market was on the table. With it came whispered expectations that those who had left and returned would know better than to speak of foreign ways. Leila attended because she wanted to reclaim a public place for herself, an act both timid and defiant. Standing at the back, she felt the cool gravity of old judgment. When the chairman called for opinions, a man named Zuffer, who'd been engaged to her once and who now chaired the market committee as if authority were a right, cleared his throat and made a speech about values and stability. He spoke of those who left and returned only when convenience beckoned, implying that their loyalty was hollow. It wasn't meant to wound her personally. Still, when he said, "We must be careful who we allow to steer this place," Leila felt an arrow of recognition. The room's small laughter felt like a shutter slamming. A ripple of eyes touched her then darted away. She stood up before she could think to stay seated. Up close, Zuffer's face was ordinary, the same freckle near his ear, the same lopsided smile he hid behind authority. Leila carried something that was no longer only private. She carried a memory of the boy he used to be, young, laughing, the person she had loved in messy, harmless ways before they became roles in a town story. "Who do you speak for, Zuffer?" she said. Her voice shook in the speechless hush. "Do you mean to decide who belongs here?" People turned. The chairman blinked. A few nodded toward him, uncomfortable with the disruption. Zuffer smiled like a man who had seen a mosquito. "This isn't about you," he said, low and condescending, as if retracting the sting would make it less true. "We're discussing safeguarding our traditions." "It's about me," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in the second sentence. "And it's about everyone who has felt small because of someone else's idea of what we must be." He scoffed. "Fine. But do you have a seat at the table, Leila? Or do you float in and out?" The remark made the room tilt. A mother too rose in front, clenched her fist beneath the pew. A child stared openly, fascinated. Leila's answer was not quick or hot. It was an ember settling into shape. I might float, she said softly, but I can bring ballast. Her fingers closed around the folded paper in her purse, the letter he had left on that windowsill. For a moment she imagined the weight of it steadier than her knees. Returning that night, the market's neon lights felt like interrogation. She held the letter under her palm all the way home, feeling the creased margin like an old scar. She had not read it since the day it was written. Not because she feared its words, but because opening it would be to accept that someone had believed otherwise, that someone had been kind in a way that made her ashamed she had never asked for it. At home, heat from the old stove pressed against her back. Her mother hummed, washing the dishes in a stream of soap and small sighs. Leila sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling, and unfolded the letter. The ink smelled faintly of lemon and the shop's oil. His handwriting slanted like an apology pretending to be a smile. He wrote of small things, a joke of a broken clock that had refused to strike two, a childhood theft of a mango, a fear of being ordinary. He wrote of being wrong, about leaving, about making assumptions, about imagining futures for others, and then, simply, he wrote, I want you to keep trying. Not because I asked you to, but because I think you are brave when you do. Tears came then, not theatrical, not loud, just two small drops that landed on the edge of the letter and darkened the line. For the first time in a long while, Leila believed someone had seen her in a way that wasn't shaped by rumor. The letter arrived with a promise he had left tucked with it, a wooden charm, carved with a single word. Stay. He had placed it with the folded page and hoped, perhaps, that time might tie their loose threads. Outside, the town slept in low breaths. Inside, between the stove's glow and the washing water's soft clink, Leila felt two conflicting truths: that judgment would follow her always, and that there were small, human hands that had once offered steadiness without strings. The next morning Zuffer's whisper reached further than the town council. It tangled with old debts, old lovers, and the brittle economy. The fight, she realized, would not be a single speech but 1,000 small repudiations, every purchase, every smile returned, every letter read aloud only in the dark. At the market the following week, a vendor refused her credit. We have rules, he said, as if he were only following them. Leila swallowed a retort. Every slight was not big enough to be a headline and not small enough to be ignored. They accumulated like wet leaves in a gutter. Each one made walking feel heavier. She began to weigh the choice: stay and push through the gravity of other people's stories about her, or leave and save herself once more. Between those two options lay the letter, gentle enough to defy the town and strong enough to push her toward a risk she hadn't meant to take. The inciting fault line of her life had changed. It was not one moment of cruelty, but the steady pressure of a town's idea of who she should be. And somewhere in the same town, a watchmaker rubbed his palm over a wooden charm and wondered if the promise he kept would ever be called upon. After that first public crack, life tightened around Leila like a glove too small. Each morning she walked the narrow streets with a new armor, businesslike tone, careful purchases, head held like a negotiation. The letter became her private ritual. She let it out in fragments, a paragraph at a time, a phrase like a splinter pulled, under the unblinking morning light. Each reading was a conversation with a man who had once seen beyond the gossip and could not, for reasons that remained murky, keep his own life from drifting away. Omar was an unlikely ally and a neat human contradiction, a watchmaker in a town that liked bold gestures. He kept a low shop with a window like a timeline, full of clocks that ticked knowledgeably at a past that would not be forgotten. He ran a small, careful life. The charm, stay, carved tiny and out of sight, had never left his palm. It sat in a drawer and sometimes came out at night when he polished it under the glow of a lamp. He was not courageous in the way the town envisioned courage. He was brave by the measure of small, sustained things. They met again when Leila began a night class teaching English to teenagers at the community center. Omar came with his nephew, a shy boy who liked mechanical things more than people. Leila's presence at the center became a minor scandal. Some parents muttered about her city ways. Yet in the classroom, among chalk dust and the smell of old books, she became something else, patient, radiant with small victories, the kind of teacher who made mistakes look like experiments. Omar watched from the back of one class for weeks. He watched the way she corrected a child's grammar with a joke instead of a sharpness that could have cut. He watched how she leaned in when someone failed. His hands, used to delicate mechanics, had a hunger for less mechanical things, human confidence, an idea he had misplaced. After class he lingered once, a crooked smile and a pocket watch offered like an apology. "You fix things that tell you the time," Leila said once, handing a stack of graded papers to a student. "How do you fix people who have no idea what time they are?" He tapped the watch's glass. "You treat them like small machines. Take them apart. Look for the stuck gears. You oil what's dry. Reassemble without rushing." "Are people watches to you?" she asked, amused despite herself. He shrugged. "They're more complicated. But sometimes they need the same patience." That answer, light as it was, threaded into her after-class walks. She started staying at the center later to pack up chairs, and she and Omar often left together. The town's gossip muttered, they always did when two known names were within sight. At the market, Zuffar's smirk widened when he saw them. He liked simple stories. But not all eyes were hostile. Mrs. Hashmi, for instance, watched them with a softness that was almost maternal. She saw, maybe, in the watchmaker and the returned girl, two people learning to be generous. As weeks folded, the two of them unfolded in small ways. Omar told her about the watch he'd been trying to repair for years, one with an engraved inscription he did not read aloud. "A promise that fell apart," he said once, and left the rest between them, unspoken. Leila told him about the letter, about how its existence felt like a permission to be softer with herself. She did not tell him all the details. She did not tell him about the nights when she would lie awake imagining the parish of faces leaning closer than they had a right to lean. The community's resistance intensified in quieter, more strategic ways. Posters at the market spoke of traditions. Anonymous notes arrived under restaurant tables, and a neighbor refused to lend his ladder because "we don't know where she has been." Rooted in the town's sense of order, the campaign was not to push her out, but to make her small enough to not be noticed. Then came a firebrand voice, a new teacher at the school, a man named Ralph, who had opinions and a talent for amplifying them. He publicly criticized Leila's teaching method one afternoon, claiming she encouraged individualism and dangerous independence, phrases like flags dropped into a pool to watch the ripples. He questioned whether someone who had left could truly teach children about commitment. The accusation landed like a stone in the classroom pond. Leila's students were confused, some were hurt. A boy named Sammy, who had once been tangled with violence at home, asked her if leaving was a cowardly thing. "No," she told him. "Leaving is sometimes the beginning of learning how to come back better." Her answer was kind but not enough to patch what had been cracked. Omar stood in the doorway the day the school meeting erupted, parents impatient, Ralph loud, Zuffar already prowling like an old guard. When a mother said, "We cannot have someone who will lead our children astray," Omar felt something like an old, small mechanical click inside him move. He raised his voice for the first time in months. "Who defines what our children need?" he asked, and the room turned on him. "Does anyone here think that staying in a comfort zone has worked for us? Or that pretending the world hasn't changed is doing them favors?" His voice shook the air. It was not a grand speech. It was the raw thing courage often is, a human refusing to play the part someone else wrote. Some eyes softened. Some hardened. Leila felt the movement inside her like a tide turning. The students rallied in small, childlike ways, notes taped to the bulletin board, an awkwardly drawn poster that read, "Ms. Leila is kind." Her mother watched this swell and, though she rarely showed it, her face softened when people began to say good things. Leila found herself smiling when she wasn't careful to notice. Small mercies wove between barbs. Yet the opposition had teeth. Vandalism struck the center, broken panes at night, anonymous threats left behind. Someone slashed the tires of the car Leila borrowed from a cousin for work. The town was learning, with systematic cruelty, that making life difficult was as effective as exile. It was slow violence, and yet no one in authority called it out. They all had reasons to keep the existing order. One night, Omar found Leila in the ruined field behind the center, the place where the kids sometimes came to play. She sat on a rusted swing, the letter open on her knees, and hands trembling as if the wind itself had teeth. He sat beside her in silence. It was the sort of silence that could be either tender or unbearable. "They're focused on what isn't important," Omar said, voice low. "They're terrified of change." "They're not terrified," Leila answered. "They just like the taste of being right." Omar looked at her. The lamp from the center threw a long rectangle across the soil. "You think about leaving again?" he asked. She pushed the hair that always fell into her face back and nodded once. "Some nights it looks easier." He put his palm on top of hers. In his hand the wooden charm warmed, "Stay," carved tiny and battered. The gesture was simple and not a rescue plan, but Leila felt steadier for it. "You don't have to leave to be safe," he said. "You have to make a place worth staying for. And sometimes the only way to do that is to keep showing up." Showing up became Leila's stubborn practice. Each class, each repair of a connection with a neighbor, each public rebuttal was a stitch. Omar, quiet and observant, offered small constancies, loaning a tool for a broken gate, defending a comment when someone else misquoted her, bringing a cup of tea when she had to stay late. They advanced like two people learning to dance in a narrow room, awkward, then a little graceful, then wholly human. But real challenges do not announce themselves politely. Ralph, who had climbed quickly through the school system on rhetoric and appetite, was a man who could manipulate authority. He confronted Leila publicly one afternoon with a petition. Signatures of parents and market vendors laid flat on the table like evidence. "We ask the council to reconsider your role," it read. Each signature was a stitch in a noose. Leila held the paper, watching the ink look insignificant. Her stomach hollowed. "Who circulated this?" she demanded, but the room's silence was a shield. No one admitted it. The petition was not only a power move, it was a message: you are not allowed to belong unless you accept the version of belonging we hand you. That evening, she found another note at her door. It had no signature. "We are protecting our children," it read in spidery script. "Stay away or don't blame us for what happens." The threat was obvious but cowardly. She told Omar. He took the note, read it, then folded it into a pocket, and placed the wooden charm he kept in his palm into her hand. The charm that had been his for years, returning it as if to offer a currency of steadiness. Her fingers closed over it like an answer. "We'll get through the noise," he said simply. "How?" she asked. "By not letting them dictate the terms of who you can be." His eyes met hers. "And by being stubborn." They were stubborn. They were also human. The steely resolve that grows in the face of community pressure is often laced with doubt. Nights came when Leila considered the letter again, and whether the man who wrote it had any idea how big his small kindness was. She kept reading his sentences like a map, letting them direct her when exhaustion threatened to erase the path. Omar, who had not spoken freely about many things, began to show her a drawer full of seconds, small clocks waiting for a part, a letter he'd never sent, a photograph of a younger brother whose smile had been promised away. They layered their lives together in small gestures. Meanwhile, Zuffer and Ralph pushed with a new tactic. They made ambiguity into rumor. By the time a rumor mentioned a man who had once offered Leila a job in the city, and another rumor claimed she had been seen with one of the market's traveling salesmen, the town's appetite for scandal bubbled. It was not that facts mattered, it was that stories were delicious. Leila took the heat by learning to speak in a new tone. She began public talks about why reading and learning mattered, she let her students present, and she invited parents into the classroom to watch. The transparency was a kind of survival. If the town could see what happened inside, there would be less room for fiction. Slowly, small allies appeared. The bakery owner who had earlier been polite now brought extra loaves for the students. Mrs. Hashmi wrote a letter to the council about how the center had helped her granddaughter. The tide shifted in small currents, not a wave. And all this while, Omar kept his promise in the palm of his hand. One evening, when the moon was thin and the market closed early, he took Leila to the back of his shop. He opened a drawer and revealed a watch with an inscription in faded ink. He read the words aloud. For when the small things need proof. It was not dramatic. It was a sentence like a letter folded into a pocket. Leila listened and felt something in her chest widen. Proof doesn't have to be a public thing. A proof can be the patient work of a person who holds your charm when storms arrive. They were building, in tiny increments, a life that would not be defined by the town's gossip. But pressure finds its weak seams. Ralph, irritated by the small wins, accused Leila of politicizing the classroom. Zufar, looking for victory, decided to make an example by bringing the matter to a council vote. Should Leila be allowed to continue teaching at the center? The day of the vote, the community center smelled of dust and unspoken things. People came with reasons they told themselves were for the children's good. The auditorium stilled when the chairman read the petition. Leila felt the weight of it as a physical thing. She could have stormed, she could have left. Instead, she stood and told the truth in the only language she thought had power, story. She spoke of a child who had read for the first time in her class, of Sammy's small grin, of the way a book had stopped a fight, once, when words were given to fury. She spoke without flourish and without accusation. Her voice collected people's attention and held it tenderly. When she sat, the vote began. Hands rose and fell in the air, a human tally. The chairman called it. We ask that Ms. Leila be suspended pending further review. The word suspended felt like a slamming door. Leila's chest constricted, but she kept her face steady. Outside, in the little square, someone started a chant, subtle, childlike, growing louder with each repetition. Let her teach, let her teach. The chant began as one student's courage and swelled with small voices until it reached the ears of the council, who couldn't ignore the sound entirely. The vote was indecisive, and the chairman, trapped between the petition's pressure and the sudden, noisy support for Leila, postponed full removal. It was a compromise, a small reprieve. But reprieve is not safety. The town had more mechanisms than one. Threats continued. Tools were missing from the center. Anonymous calls warning parents reached phones at odd hours. The campaign lost neither cunning nor will. Through it all, Leila clung to the letter and to the steady palm that offered a charm. The two relics, paper and wood, became more than mementos. They were proof that someone had once believed. Such proof is dangerous because it frees you from needing others' permission to be brave. Leila began to notice it. In the mornings she woke earlier to prepare lessons. She walked home with her chin less obligated to the shadows. The town was changing, slowly and begrudgingly, and so was she. The confrontation came at the Festival of Lights, a night when the town filled with lanterns and expects stories to end properly. Zufar had chosen the event carefully. Crowds would thin the sense of consequence and make spectacle useful for annihilation. He arranged a stage in the square and invited townspeople to attend a values address. Rumors said a vote would be called there to remove Leila from teaching permanently. Leila debated staying away. Attendance would look like capitulation. Absence would let the council speak into emptier rooms. Leaving would feel like conceding the field. In the end, she went because children would be there. She could not accept that the future might be decided by optics and cruelty. Omar stood at the edge of the square, the wooden charm safe in his palm. He had placed a watch on the stage, the same antiquated piece with the inscription he'd shown her, small furniture for a big argument. Proof, he had said earlier, speaks better than accusations. He did not expect it to change everyone's mind, but he wanted to be counted as part of the story. Zufar spoke with the kind of ease that comes from a practiced animus. He painted a picture of disorder, of decline, of outsiders, returning to infect the moral stock of the children. He used economic metaphors, community anecdotes, half-truths. He harnessed fear. The crowd clapped at the edges. Some faces showed confusion, some wearied acceptance. When it was her turn, Leila walked onto the stage with a student named Sammy at her side. She did not bring the letter or the charm, only herself and the facts she had collected like tools. She told the crowd what the classroom had done. She recited students' work aloud, poems of small bravery and essays about kindness. Her voice did not tremble. The town listened, some as if hearing a new language for the first time. Ralph stood and denounced her again, unashamed. He said the petitions were not about one woman but about protecting the children. A murmur moved through the crowd. Zuffer, smelling victory, called for a vote. All in favor of removing Ms. Leila from her position, raise your hands. It felt like a play where stakes had been written in ink. Hands went up, but slowly, then faster, until the majority seemed certain. Leila felt the air narrow. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak. Then, from the back, a small voice rang out. "That's not fair," said Sammy. Other children began to murmur. Parents shifted uneasily. A father who had once told everyone Leila was trouble now fidgeted as if remembering his own girl's homework. People began to lower their suspicion under the clear weight of their own children. The momentum changed. The crowd resembled a tide indecisive in shallow water. At that moment, Omar climbed the steps and stood beside the chairman. He held the old watch aloft so the inscription caught the lantern light. "Look," he said quietly but so that voices turned. "This watch was given to me when I was young. Its promise was for remaining at small things. I didn't always keep it. But I have kept this person, Leila, safe when others tried to speak for her." He turned the watch so the carving was visible, small scratched letters read, "For when the small things need proof." Silence did not shut the crowd, it opened them. He told the story of the carved charm, how he'd held it in his palm for years, how he had intended to give it back if ever he could meet the courage to do so. He spoke of the afternoons he'd watched Leila help a child read. He talked about a moment of compassion when a student had put away a stone rather than throw it, that small act being, he said, its own revolution. When he finished, a part of the town could not remain as prepared to vote. The display of small proof, of human closeness, of witness, pierced the theatricality of Zuffer's speech. The chairman invited discussion. Parents rose and said what the children had already shown them, that the center mattered. In the uproar and earnestness, a new truth unfolded. Politics in a small place could be beaten with attention, with testimony, with ordinary people remembering they loved their children more than their grudges. The vote would not remove her. Instead, it would call for a review and an immediate suspension of the petition. It was not a triumph, but it was a reprieve and a rebalancing. Zuffer fumed but could not produce the unanimous front he'd hoped for. Ralph blinked and murmured of technicalities. The crowd dispersed under lantern light, some still whispering about values, but many more whispering about the good work the center did. Later, as the town packed away its lanterns, Leila and Omar sat on the steps under a sky now softer than the one under which she first read the letter. She had a bruise near her ribcage from fear, but her eyes were clear. Sammy, asleep against his mother's shoulder, clutched a book to his chest like a talisman. Children were small proof of what had been won. "Why did you come up?" Leila asked Omar, thumb idly tracing the carving on the watch he had shown. "Because some promises are the only honest currency we have," he answered. "Your students needed more than a speech. They needed to know someone would hold their learning like it mattered." He placed the wooden charm, "Stay," into her palm. It felt warm, like a live thing. She closed her fingers. The charm and the letter were now two different kinds of permission, one public, one private. Together they told her she could choose the terms of her belonging. They sat in the silence a long while. For Leila, the confrontation had been a crucible. For Omar, it had been a moment of stepping out from behind clocks into an uncertain witness. The town's noise would not end, but the community's ear had been retuned toward possibility. They had fought not with grandeur but with evidence and witness, the exact tools necessary to sway a small town that made decisions based more on feeling than federal law. After the festival, the campaign against Leila lost much of its steam. Zuffer retreated to his committee room, nursing strategic defeats and cultivating quiet vexations. Ralph, his thunder found wanting in the face of children's voices, returned to classrooms that murmured with both admiration and worry. The center, battered but functional, resumed classes under a fragile truce. Leila found the days afterward rife with small restorations. Parents who had been uncertain came to the center and apologized awkwardly, as if politeness could stitch what many had tried to tear. A local shop posted a sign, "Books for Youth, Teaching for Hearts," and placed Leila's class schedule beneath it. The bakery renewed its biscuit program for students. These are not dramatic pivots, but they were the practicalities of healing a community, small rituals that double as repair. Her mother watched the shifts, the letters left under the stove when guests left, the neighborhood gossip that softened, and folded it into gratitude that was sometimes clumsy and quiet. They began to speak more at dinner, exchanging small stories about the day's fights and triumphs. One night Leila's mother pulled out a photograph of a younger Leila, hair braided and eyes full of temper and promise, and placed it in front of her daughter. "You once wanted to be a teacher," her mother said, almost as if stating a fact the world had forgotten. "You always had a stubbornness that could make things better, even when it made other people uncomfortable." Leila smiled, a wet thing that felt real. "I still do." In the classroom, she saw the changes in more obvious ways. Sammy read aloud with a confidence that stunned his father. A girl named Farah stopped writing the same apology at the end of each essay, and added instead a line that made them all laugh. The students brought crafts. A boy gave her a bracelet made of spare watch parts, a little gift to the person who had made time matter. Leila accepted each gift like a currency of repair. She also learned to set boundaries. After the events, someone suggested she campaign for a larger role at the center. The offer came with praise and an inference that she must now prove she's worthy. Leila hesitated. Having been buffeted by the town, she recognized the coiling temptation to prove oneself in ways that only feed vanity. She consulted Omar. "What do you want?" he asked. She blinked. It was the simplest question and the most difficult. "To keep teaching," she said. "To be allowed to do my small work well." He nodded. "Then do that and refuse to be defined by politics." Leila became adept at small resistances. When Zuffer attempted to reinsert himself in petty ways, commenting at events or instructing the guard at the center about morality, she answered with rigid professionalism and continued to let students' work speak for their progress. The power of quiet competence can be a slow, steady weapon. The town, of course, still had its undercurrents. Old slights occasionally showed up like rain in the margins, a page torn from a student's notebook, a morning when the center's electricity flickered suspiciously. Leila's traumas were not erased by a vote or a public defense. They remained as scars that sometimes ached. She learned to be honest about the aches, tell a friend, smack her own hand when it clenched into bitterness, and return to the work. Omar's role in the community remained subtle. He fixed clocks, kept his shop open, and took care of his nephew. But his presence at the center became a kind of quiet solidity. He mended broken chairs, replaced bulbs, and listened to the parents who wanted to complain but didn't know where to begin. The watch he had shown at the festival was put back into its drawer, only now, it no longer lived as a relic in darkness. The charm, stay, that he'd offered to Leila rested often in her purse, sometimes in his pocket, their possession a mutual pact rather than a unilateral gift. Leila's relationship with her mother uncovered deeper layers. Her mother had been shaped by a generation that preferred endurance to confrontation. Yet she showed up at school events, sometimes slotted into a chair in the back, and clapped when a parent praised her daughter's patience. One evening, after a long day, they drank tea on the roof and watched the town exhale into night. "You were brave," her mother said, in the way of an admission that took days to warm to the tongue. "Not because you didn't fear them, but because you kept walking." Leila measured the compliment like a weight and found it balanced. "I was scared," she said. "But someone put a letter on my windowsill once. He made room for me to try." Her mother hummed. "Maybe keep the letters and the people who hand them to you close. We need both." In the months that followed, Leila and Omar encountered quiet, human milestones. A student won a small regional reading prize. The community center gained an extra hour of funding through a municipal grant the council had approved begrudgingly after many endorsements. These victories were not cinematic, but they mattered, evidence that the small work she did began to ripple outward. They also shared private moments that felt like the slow arranging of a life. They would sometimes walk the riverbank at dusk, talking about trivialities: the newest broken clock in Omar's shop, the list of books Leila wanted to teach next year. Sometimes they sat in silence and read. Other nights they argued about small things: Omar's habit of fixing things that were not broken, Leila's tendency to take blame even when she wasn't at fault. They learned to apologize and to listen. One evening in late autumn, as leaves burned in red and gold, Omar took Leila to the old field where she had first read the letter. He carried a box of matches, a packet of lanterns, and a small wooden frame. He was quiet as they walked under oak branches. When they reached the middle of the field, he placed the frame on a flat stone and opened it to reveal a carefully arranged collage of papers, students' letters, a child's drawing of the center with a smiling teacher, and the watch, small and dignified, nestled like proof. "Proof," he said again, smiling. "But not the kind you need to carry everywhere. Proof for when you doubt." Leila pressed her forehead to the frame. It smelled like glue and orange peel and school glue. For a long time they sat there, the frames of their lives coming into alignment like carefully wound gears. Things did not smooth into perfection. They never do. But the ferocity of the storm had passed, leaving behind good soil. In its wake, Leila's posture changed. She began to invite parents into class, started a Saturday reading club, and argued for the center's needs in meetings. She found that public life could be a place to extend her quiet stubbornness into civic action. And somewhere in the town, Zufar readjusted his tactics. He invested in appearances of benevolence to hide his bruised vanity. But his speeches failed to attract the fervor they'd once had. People grew weary of simplistic answers to complex needs. The town's appetite for drama was substantial, but it had limits. Kindness, persistent and ordinary, had begun to occupy more space than gossip. Through it all, Leila learned something crucial: belonging was not a thing that could be handed to you by a vote or a speech. It was slow. It required showing up. It required refusing to equate worth with rumor. And it required, sometimes, a letter folded into your hand and a charm warm in your palm to remind you that someone else had once trusted you enough to ask you to stay. Years later, the town would tell the story differently depending on who told it. Some would say Leila was always brave. Others would remember the scuffle and frame it as a lesson. But the truth lived in small things: the laugh of children spilling from the center, the repaired clocks that still kept time in Omar's shop, and a framed collage that sat in the community room like a quiet monument to patient work. Leila stood under the stars one evening, the same field humming with insect notes. In her palm she held the wooden charm again, smooth now by years of being passed between hands. Beside her, Omar read a note aloud, one she had written and once been too frightened to send. His thumb traced the letters like cartography, like a map of how far they had come. She had learned, in a town that loved stories more than nuance, to write her own, not a shout but a ledger of small truths. She had taught children to read and, in doing so, taught herself to listen. The letter on her lap, the charm in her hand, and the man who had given it all made a constellation of proof. Under the same stars, she breathed and counted the small things that kept her: lessons, students, friendships, stubborn hours, and found she had made a place worth staying for. The town continued to whisper, as towns do. But now when it whispered about Leila it said, in voices muffled and kinder, "She stayed."